This is Algebra 1, Lesson 7b, Simplifying More Difficult Notations. What a title, right? It's going to include examples 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, and 7.4. Here's what they call a complicated expression. Don't be stressed about this, though. We can do it. Let's talk about a way to do this, breaking it down so that we're not overwhelmed about having to do that whole thing at one time. You shouldn't be able to just look at this entire thing and then say, well, that's what that's equal to. We're not going to do that, okay? What we're going to do is a way to take it apart and answer it. So we see that we can divide this up and enclose the numbers that are going to be added together. So you see this addition right here and this addition right here. It's dividing up these parts. All of these things that I'm circling are being added, okay? And we can do that. We know how to do addition. It's just these parts that are being added are complicated. So the previous lesson talked about a different way to think about this symbol. We can think of this as the opposite of the opposite of 4, or we can think about it as the opposite of negative 4. Well, what's the opposite of negative 4? Well, that would just be positive 4. That's a lot simpler. We can bring down our plus sign. Here we have a negative 2, or the opposite of 2, which is a negative 2. So we'll leave it like that. And I'm going to go ahead and you can put this in parentheses if you want it. It helps you to see it. It's something separate being added. And then I'm going to add here. Let's think about this. This is the opposite of negative 6, which would just be positive 6. Okay. And I want to talk about this for just a second here. We use parentheses, but then if we have something in parentheses that needs to also be in grouping symbols, we usually, the next level would be to use brackets. And then if you have more, you use braces, which we'll look at later. But just in case that's new to you, I will show that to you. All right, now, just like in a previous video, when we're adding more than 2 numbers, we can add our positives together. That's going to give us 10 positives plus, and then we bring over this negative 2. Now that we're adding things that have different signs, we're going to subtract their absolute values and get 8, and take the sign of the one with the largest absolute value, which is 10, and it's positive. So our answer is 8, which is much easier than just trying to go from here to the answer. So I would expect when you do these in your homework for you to copy the problem, circle some things, rewrite the problem as you simplify it like I did here. Maybe even do some underlining like I did to help you make sure you're combining all of the terms and getting your final answer. So there's not just going to be a problem and then an answer. There should be some steps in between. All right, let's do this example. Example 7.1. Okay, so we're going to try to do the same thing we did in the last problem, where we're looking at what is being added or maybe even subtracted. And I know a lot of students will ask me, they'll say, well, how do I know the difference between when this is a subtract or when this is a negative? And that can be kind of confusing. Well, I kind of see one whole thing here, okay, and there's nothing in front of it. So it's not a subtract. It's not like some number here minus that. So we can see that that's a negative. And then this looks like we've got a minus here because then there's another thing. So let's take this other thing. Actually, you know what? I think it's going to be easier if we just go ahead and take all of it. And I show you that you can do it exactly that way. That way there's no confusion. And then we will take this, and then we will take this, and we will take this. Okay, there's lots of different ways of thinking about these, but I'm going to show you this way that if you're struggling with it, if this is new to you, it should work for everybody. Okay, so let's just simplify each little part. Let's think of this as the opposite of positive 4, which would be negative 4. Then we're going to insert a plus. Okay, we're just inserting, we're adding all of these things together, and we're going to add to it this next part, the opposite of negative 5, which is just positive 5. And then we're going to add to it, this one's easy, just a positive 5. And you don't even have to have that plus in front of the 5, that positive, because if you don't write that, it's positive, just like I did here. Okay, and then I'm going to insert a plus, and then I'm going to think of this as the opposite of negative 3, which is positive 3. And then I'm going to insert a plus sign, and this is just adding a negative 6, right? So this is just a negative 6. I'm adding a negative 6. Okay, now I can look through here and see which ones are positive, which ones are negative, and let's combine those. I have a negative 4 and a negative 6, which is a negative 10. Now I'm going to get my positives. I have a 5 and a 5, which makes 10, plus a 3, which is a 13, and those are all positives. Now I'm going to combine two things that have different signs, so I'm going to subtract them, subtract their absolute values, and get 3, and take the sign of the one with the largest absolute value, which is 13 in this case, and it's positive, so my answer is going to be positive, and that's a positive 3. Example 7.2. Lots of stuff here. Let's circle it, and let's circle this, and let's circle this. In fact, I'm even going to go back, circle all of that. Okay, and then we're inserting a plus sign here, which would be the same thing as a plus. If it's a negative, just, or a minus, if you're not even sure which one it is, if it's this symbol, just go ahead and circle it, and we'll take care of it. Okay, I think that's the easiest way to do it. So here we have the opposite of negative 3, which is positive 3. I'm going to insert a plus sign, and then I'm going to deal with this here. I've got a negative 2, and I'm taking the opposite of it, which would make it a positive 2. And this would make it a negative 2 again. So that simplifies to a negative 2. Plus, and then I'll have here, I've got a negative 3, and I'm taking the opposite of it, which would be positive 3. Now I'm going to combine all my positives, and I get 6. And my negatives, and I get negative 2. Now I'm going to combine things that have different signs. So I subtract their absolute values and get 4. And I take the sign of the one that had the largest absolute value, which is 6. And it's positive. So the answer will be positive 4. Example 7.3. The textbook definition suggests, can you picture the circled enclosures just in your mind mentally and not have to write them? Now, if you still need to write them, if this is new to you, then write them. That's totally fine. And I would do it like this, and I would do it like this, I would do it like this, and then I would simplify each circled part, right? And then I would do it the way we did the last example. I'm going to try to do it with you without writing the enclosures. So I'm just going to take this first part here and say, well, that looks like the opposite of negative 4, which would be a positive 4. I'm going to insert a plus, and here I just have plus a negative 2. That's just negative 2. And then here I have the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of 6, or the opposite of negative 6, which is 6. And then take the opposite, which is negative 6. You can take each one separately. Okay? Once you've got it simplified, it becomes an old problem. We only have this one positive. Now let's put our negatives together. Then we're going to subtract their absolute values since they have different signs, and take the sign of the one with the largest absolute value. And our answer is negative 4. In 7.4, this one looks familiar because we did it a little bit ago, but we showed all of the steps. This time we're going to try to do it without drawing the enclosures and without adding the extra parentheses to see if we can do it that way. Okay? So we're going to think here, I'm going to underline just so you can tell what I'm looking at, but I'm not going to circle anything. That is the opposite of positive 4, so I'm just going to write negative 4. Okay? And then I'm going to look over beside it here, and I'm going to think about this as being the opposite of negative 5. This would be the opposite of negative 5, which would just be a positive 5. And then here, it's just a plus 5. And then here, the opposite of negative 3. The opposite of negative 3, which would be a positive 3. And then we have here plus a negative 6. Adding a negative 6 is like subtracting 6, or you could say plus a negative 6. If you wanted to, it would be the same thing. Now we can combine the things that have minuses or negatives in front of them. This and this would be negative 10. I'm going to combine my positives. 5 and 5 is 10, plus 3 is 13. I'm combining things that have different signs, so I subtract them, and I take the sign of the one that has the largest absolute value, which is 13, and it's positive. So you can look back at the first time I did this problem in the earlier example, and you can see, it was example 7.1, you can see that if this is new to you, if you're struggling with it, yes, certainly. Circle everything, write the enclosures, the circles here, and then show those steps going down. But if it's making sense to you, you've had enough practice with it, maybe you can go ahead and do it without that. Or maybe after a couple homework sections, you'll be able to do it without that. But it's a good goal to be able to get to the point where you don't have to show those. You have already learned a lot, okay? Even if you have had some positive and negative numbers, adding them and subtracting them before, these problems, I mean, look at this. This is a long problem, okay? So you've already learned a lot. Just keep practicing. Don't get discouraged. There's even a little note in the book. It says it might take a lot of practice to become adept in doing simplifications such as this one. Do not get discouraged if you find these problems troublesome. Just keep practicing.